It started as a normal camping trip, just like the dozens I'd gone on before. My friends and I always made it a tradition to escape the city once every summer, pitching tents under the stars and pretending we weren't tethered to the humdrum of daily life. This time, we chose the Adirondacks, a sprawling, dense wilderness that seemed untouched by time. We wanted isolation, and boy did we get it. The first day was uneventful. We found a spot near a lazy river surrounded by towering pines. There wasn't another soul in sight. That night, we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped ghost stories. You know, the typical camping stuff. Around midnight, as the fire dwindled, the others crawled into their tents. I stayed up a little longer, nursing the last beer, enjoying the silence. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird or the wind, but a clear, deliberate whistle. 3 notes, rising, falling, then rising again. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods. My first thought was that someone else was camping nearby, but it felt off. Too intentional, too precise. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just jumpy because of the ghost stories. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends. Mike laughed, saying it was probably just some weirdo out there messing around. Jenna, ever the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "You probably imagined it," she said. Still, I noticed how she glanced over her shoulder later as we hiked along the river. As the sun set that second night, the woods took on a different personality. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle felt like it was creeping closer. We tried to shake it off, cracking jokes and stoking the fire higher, but an unspoken tension hung in the air. Around 11, it happened again. The whistle. Those same 3 notes. Closer this time. We all froze. Even Mike, who had laughed at me earlier, went pale. "Is it an animal?" he whispered, though it sounded more like a plea than a question. Jenna shook her head, her face blank. We decided to call it a night, hoping the tents would feel safer. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The whistle came again, louder. This time it circled us, moving from one side of the campsite to the other, impossibly fast. I clutched my flashlight, every muscle tensed, listening to my own heartbeat. Then, there were footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching the pine needles just outside my tent. They stopped directly behind me. I held my breath, convinced whoever or whatever was out there could hear me trembling. And then, a laugh. A low, guttural laugh, like someone choking on gravel. I shot out of the tent, flashlight swinging wildly. "Who's there?" I yelled. Mike and Jenna emerged, their faces pale and scared. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt alive. "Let's leave," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "Now." We packed in record time, shoving gear haphazardly into backpacks. The fire was still smoldering when we hit the trail. None of us cared. We just wanted out. But the forest wasn't letting us go. The trail seemed to twist and change. Landmarks we'd passed earlier, an old moss-covered log, a strange rock formation, appeared in places they shouldn't. No matter how far we walked, we never seemed to get any closer to the main road. Worse, the whistle followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but always there. Those same 3 notes. At one point, we spotted a cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward it, yelling for help. As we got closer, though, the relief turned to dread. The cabin was ancient, its wood rotting and roof caved in. Something about it felt wrong. The windows were dark, but I swear I saw movement inside, just the faintest shadow flickering past. Jenna grabbed my arm. "Don't go in there." "But don't." The whistle came again, sharper, angrier. It was so loud it drowned out everything else. We bolted, running blindly through the woods. Branches clawed at my face, roots tripped me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, the sound faded. We stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air. Mike checked his phone. It had no signal, of course, but the time stopped me cold. It was 3:33 a.m. We'd been running for hours, yet it felt like minutes. Jenna pointed to something in the dirt, a footprint. Huge, too big to be human, with elongated toes that ended in sharp points. "What the hell made that?" she whispered. We didn't wait to find out. Somehow, we found our way back to the campsite by dawn. The fire was still smoldering, exactly as we'd left it. It didn't make sense. None of it did. We grabbed our stuff and kept moving, desperate to find the road. Finally, hours later, we saw it, a gravel path cutting through the trees. Relief crashed over me like a wave. We practically ran to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, its shape distorted like it wasn't fully there. It raised a hand and waved, and then, just before we turned the corner, it smiled. We didn't stop until we hit the city. Even now, Years later, I still hear that whistle sometimes, late at night. Rising, falling, then rising again, 3 notes, and every time I wonder if it's just my imagination or if it's waiting for me to come back.
Story number 2.
I never wanted to move to the country. I grew up surrounded by the hum of city life, the reassuring glow of street lights, the comforting noise of neighbors just a wall away. But when my partner Sam inherited a farmhouse deep in the heart of rural Georgia, it felt like a blessing. A fresh start, they said. We can finally have some peace. Peace. That's what I thought we'd find out there. The house was old, crumbling in places, with warped wooden floors and windows that creaked in protest every time you opened them. The kind of place with character, Sam said. The property stretched for acres, most of it thick, untamed woods. I hated it from the start. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the way the woods seemed to press in around us, as though the house was a tiny island in an ocean of trees. And the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the land was holding its breath. The first night, I woke up to scratching. Faint, rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. I figured it was just the house settling or an animal scurrying around. I didn't bother waking Sam, but then it happened again the second night. Louder this time. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and peered out the bedroom window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Endless, suffocating trees. Sam told me I was being paranoid, that it was probably raccoons or stray cats. We're not in the city anymore, they reminded me with a smile. You'll get used to it. I didn't. A week later, I found the marks. I was out by the edge of the woods, trying to clear some overgrown brush near the garden, when I noticed deep gouges in the bark of a tree. 4 parallel lines, as though something with massive claws had raked through it. The cuts were fresh. I called Sam over, but they just shrugged. Probably a bear, they said. Bears don't live this far south, I shot back. Sam rolled their eyes and went back inside. That night, the scratching came again. This time, it wasn't outside. It was in the walls. I shook Sam awake, my heart pounding. Listen. We both sat in silence, straining to hear. And then it came again, faint at first, then louder, like nails dragging along the wooden beams inside the house. Rats, Sam muttered, though their voice didn't sound convinced. But when we called an exterminator the next day, they didn't find any droppings, nests, or signs of infestation. Place looks clean to me, the man said, tipping his hat. That's when I started hearing whispers. It started faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But the words became clearer as the nights went on. A woman's voice, low and melodic, calling my name. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the whisper still echoing in my ears. Sam said I was dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a warning. One night, I decided to stay up. Sam had long since fallen asleep, their snores echoing through the room. I sat by the window, staring out at the woods, waiting for something. Around 2 a.m., the whisper started again. This time, it was closer. I grabbed the flashlight and slipped outside, the beam trembling in my hands. The air was cold and still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whisper came again, floating on the breeze. It was coming from the woods. Every rational part of me screamed to go back inside, to lock the door and never look back. But something drew me forward, a pull I couldn't resist. I stepped into the trees, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, leading me deeper into the forest. My breath came in short gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw it, a figure, pale and thin, standing in the clearing ahead. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her hair was long and matted, her limbs unnaturally long, her fingers ending in sharp, blackened tips. She turned toward me and I saw her face. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow, and her mouth was stretched into a grin far too wide for her face. She raised one hand, the claws glinting in the moonlight, and pointed at me. "Come," she whispered. Her voice was like a razor against my skin. I stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from my hand. As it hit the ground, the beam flickered, plunging the clearing into darkness. I don't remember running back to the house. I don't remember slamming the door or locking it. But I must have, because when I came to, I was curled up on the floor of the living room, shaking uncontrollably. Sam found me there the next morning. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but they just gave me that same skeptical look. "You need sleep," they said. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. That night, the scratching came back, louder than ever. The walls seemed to vibrate with it, the sound echoing through the house. I could hear the whisper, too, louder now, and it wasn't just my name. "Let me in." The next morning, I found the marks on the front door. 4 deep gashes, just like the ones on the tree. We packed our things that afternoon. Sam argued, said we couldn't just leave, but I didn't care. Something was out there, something that wasn't going to stop. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the woods one last time. She was there, standing at the edge of the trees, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She raised her hand and waved, her mouth stretching into that horrible, too-wide grin. We drove away and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and Sam is asleep, I hear it again. Scratching. And the whisper, calling my name.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a small town in Maine. The kind of place where everyone knows your name and nothing exciting ever happens. That's probably why the story of Old Man Harris became such a big deal. Harris had lived alone in a crumbling farmhouse just on the outskirts of town. People said he was strange, a recluse who only came into town once a month for supplies. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, it was always muttering about keeping them out. No one knew what he meant. One summer night when I was 13, Harris was found dead. Heart attack, the coroner said. But what made it eerie was the state of his house. The doors and windows were all boarded up from the inside, locks on every cabinet and drawer, and strange symbols scratched into the walls. The rumor mill went wild. After his death, no one wanted to buy the house. It sat abandoned for years, decaying further with each season. That's how it became a rite of passage for local teens. If you wanted to prove you were brave, you spent a night in Harris's house. I wasn't brave. I knew that. But when my friends dared me to do it, I couldn't back down. The fear of being called a coward was worse than the thought of spending one night in an old, creepy house. So, one Friday night, armed with flashlights, snacks, and a sleeping bag, I made my way to the house. My friends promised to wait outside in the car, but as soon as I stepped through the warped front door, I heard the engine start and the car speed away. Jerks, I muttered under my breath, trying to steady my nerves. The house smelled of mildew and decay. Moonlight seeped through cracks in the boards covering the windows, casting strange shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick, like it hadn't moved in years. I sat up in the living room, trying to make myself comfortable on the dusty wooden floor. The house creaked and groaned, but I told myself it was just the wind. Around midnight, the temperature dropped. My breath puffed in the air, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping coming from upstairs. I froze, every muscle tensed. It wasn't the random creak of an old house settling. It was deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone drumming their fingers on a table. I tried to tell myself it was just a raccoon or a bird that had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew better. The tapping grew louder, sharper, as if whatever was making the noise was descending the staircase. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it toward the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, then a new sound. Scratching. Slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the kitchen. I stood, my legs shaking, and inched toward the sound. The scratching grew louder, more frantic as I approached the kitchen door. When I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Heavy. Oppressive. My flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the old pantry door. The scratches were fresh, deep gouges in the wood. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. It hit the floor, spinning, its beam casting wild shadows across the room. The rattling stopped. Breathing heavily, I picked up the flashlight and backed out of the kitchen. I didn't want to know what was behind that door. As I turned to head back to the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the base of the stairs. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows obscured its face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My legs felt like lead. Then it started to move. Slowly, methodically, it took one step toward me, then another. Its footsteps echoed in the silence, a horrible, deliberate sound that seemed to grow louder with each step. My instincts kicked in and I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. I bolted up the stairs, my flashlight barely illuminating the narrow hallway. I ducked into the first room I found and slammed the door shut, throwing myself against it. For a moment, everything was quiet. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. Then I heard it, whispering. It was faint at first, a soft, unintelligible murmur. But it grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. They overlapped, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, their tone urgent and angry. The whispers were coming from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then I saw it. The symbols. They were carved into the walls, just like the ones people had whispered about when Harris died. They seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the door behind me began to shake. Something was trying to get in. I turned, pressing my back against the wall, and that's when I saw the figure again. It was in the corner of the room, hunched over, its limbs twisted and wrong, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. Its voice was a dozen voices at once, overlapping and distorted. I bolted for the window, throwing it open and scrambling onto the roof. I didn't care about the height, I just needed to get out. I jumped, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't stop. I ran, hobbling as fast as I could, the whispers still echoing in my ears. When I reached the road, my friends were there, laughing and joking, completely oblivious to the nightmare I just endured. I screamed at them to drive, and they finally saw the terror on my face. We sped away, the house disappearing into the distance. But as we rounded the corner, I glanced back one last time. The figure stood in the window, watching me, its twisted grin the last thing I saw before we disappeared into the night. I never went back to that house. No one has. But sometimes when I'm alone, I hear the whispers. They're faint, just on the edge of hearing, but they're there. And I know, deep down, that it's not over.
Story number 4.
They say the Devil's Pass isn't on any map. You don't find it, it finds you. I didn't believe it until the night I stumbled across it and learned why no one ever comes back. It was late October, the air crisp and filled with the scent of rotting leaves. I was driving back from a work trip, the kind that always seems to drag on too long. The highway stretched empty for miles, my headlights cutting through the darkness. My phone had no signal, and the gas station I'd stopped at an hour ago was the last sign of civilization. Somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The smooth pavement gave way to a cracked, uneven road lined with gnarled trees. My GPS glitched, then froze, the little arrow spinning in circles. Frustrated, I kept driving, hoping to find a sign or a turnoff back to the main road. That's when I saw the fog. It rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the road ahead. I slowed down, gripping the wheel tighter. The headlights barely penetrated the haze, and the world outside became a swirling gray void. Then I saw it, a wooden sign looming out of the mist, the letters carved in jagged script. Devil's Pass. My stomach tightened. The name triggered a faint memory, something about local legends. Stories of a cursed road where people vanished without a trace. But those were just tales, right? Urban legends to keep kids from wandering too far. Still, unease crept over me. I considered turning around, but the road was too narrow. Reversing would be impossible in the thick fog. I told myself it was just a name, nothing more, and pressed on. The road twisted and turned, narrowing as the trees seemed to press closer. Their skeletal branches reached toward the car like bony fingers. The fog muffled everything, the engine, the crunch of gravel under my tires, even the sound of my own breathing. That's when I noticed the figures. At first, they were just shadows at the edges of the road, barely visible through the fog. But as I drove, they became clearer. Pale, motionless shapes standing among the trees. People. I slowed to a crawl, my heart hammering. My headlights swept over them, and I caught glimpses, blank faces, empty eyes, bodies that didn't move, didn't breathe. They stood like statues, watching as I passed. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Mannequins? Scarecrows? A twisted prank? But deep down, I knew none of those answers fit. The farther I drove, the more they appeared. Dozens of them, then hundreds, lining the road. Some stood alone, others in groups, their heads tilted unnaturally, their hands outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Just keep driving," I muttered to myself. That's when the radio turned on. I hadn't touched it. The dial spun on its own, static hissing through the speakers. Then a voice broke through, low and distorted. "Turn back." I slammed my hand against the knob, trying to shut it off, but the voice continued, rising in intensity. Turn back before it's too late." The car lurched as the engines sputtered, the headlights flickering. Panic set in as I pressed the gas, willing the car to keep moving. The fog thickened, swirling like something alive, and the figures began to move. At first, it was subtle, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture. But then they started stepping onto the road. I swerved, narrowly avoiding one that appeared directly in front of me. its face pressed against the windshield, empty eye sockets boring into mine. I screamed, jerking the wheel, and the car skidded off the road. The engine died. I sat there, paralyzed, the fog seeping into the car like a living thing. The figures surrounded me now, their blank faces peering through the windows. They didn't touch the car, didn't try to open the doors. They just stared. Then, one by one, they began to whisper. The sound was faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but it grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was insistent, demanding. Desperate, I grabbed my phone. Still no signal. The battery icon flashed red, then died completely. "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Just let me go." A shadow moved in front of the car, larger and darker than the others. It wasn't like them. Its shape was wrong, shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The whispers stopped. The thing stepped closer, its presence filling the air with a crushing weight. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe as it leaned forward, its face inches from mine. Its eyes weren't empty like the others. They burned with a sickly yellow light, filled with malice and hunger. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding metal. "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing reached for the door, its hand passing through the glass as if it wasn't there. Its fingers, long and clawed, wrapped around my arm. Cold, so cold it felt like fire. Pain shot through me as it pulled, dragging me from the car. The world spun, and the ground disappeared beneath me. I was falling, swallowed by darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car nowhere in sight. The sun was rising, burning away the last traces of fog. I staggered to my feet, my body aching. The road behind me was empty, the figures gone. In the distance, I saw a gas station, the one I'd stopped at earlier. I don't remember walking there, but somehow I ended up inside. The clerk looked at me like I was a ghost. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. When I asked what he meant, his face grew pale. "You were on Devil's Pass," he said, shaking his head. "No one ever makes it out of there." I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone. But sometimes late at night, I hear the whispers again. Soft, insistent, calling my name. I don't look out the window anymore.
Story number 5.
It started with the letters. 3 weeks ago, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting. I thought it was junk mail at first, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. Written in the same uneven script were 3 words, "Do not look." I laughed it off as some kind of prank, probably from one of the neighborhood kids. But the next day, another letter arrived. This one was more urgent. "They're watching." I should have been unnerved, but instead I was annoyed. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, assuming it was part of the same joke. The third letter came 2 days later. This time it was different. The handwriting was neater, more precise, as though the sender had taken extra care. The message was longer. "You're not safe. Stop looking. They can see you now." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I hadn't been looking for anything. I was just living my life. But something about the way the words were written made my skin crawl. That night, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows before going to bed. The dreams started soon after. In the first one, I was standing in a dark forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches twisting together to block out the moonlight. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Something was watching me from the shadows, its presence heavy and oppressive. When I woke up, my sheets were soaked with sweat, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next day, the 4th letter arrived. "They are closer now. You let them in." I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, but they weren't much help. "Probably just a prank," the officer said. "Let us know if it escalates." That night, I stayed up late, watching TV to distract myself. Around 2 a.m., the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and for a moment I just sat there, frozen. Then I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. My heart leapt into my throat. I told myself it was just the wind, a branch brushing against the glass. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped. I sighed in relief, but then I heard it again, this time from the back door. Tap, tap, tap. The flashlight shook in my hand as I moved toward the sound. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side of the door wanted to be let in. I shone the light through the small glass pane in the door, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood there, tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. Its hand, pale and skeletal, tapped against the glass. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The tapping stopped, and the house fell silent. When I finally gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. Gone. The next morning, I found another letter on my porch. You looked. Now they see you. They always see you. I called in sick to work and spent the day locking every door and window, drawing the curtains, and pacing the house. Every shadow, every creak felt like a threat. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard the whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct. A dozen voices, overlapping and chaotic, filling the room. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside, they were inside my head. Look at us. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking back and forth on the floor. Leave me alone, I screamed. The whispers stopped. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. But I could feel it. Something was still there, watching, waiting. The next few days passed in a blur. I stopped going outside, stopped answering my phone. The letters kept coming, each one more ominous than the last. It's too late. You can't hide. They are with you now. I tried burning them, but they always reappeared, pristine and untouched, in the same spot on my kitchen counter. Then, last night, the final letter arrived. You will see them tonight. I didn't bother locking the doors. I knew it wouldn't matter. At exactly midnight, the lights flickered, then went out. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. I sat on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife, though I knew it wouldn't help. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, taking on forms that weren't entirely human. They emerged from the corners, tall and thin, their faces pale and eyeless. Their mouths stretched into unnatural grins, and their hands reached out for me, their fingers impossibly long. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The tallest one stepped forward, its face inches from mine. We told you not to look, it hissed, its voice a cacophony of whispers. Then everything went black. I woke up this morning on the floor. The house eerily quiet. The letters were gone, and the shadows were still. But I know they're not gone. Not really. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye I see them, watching, waiting, and every night the whispers return.
Story number 6.
The cabin in the woods wasn't supposed to be creepy. It was a rustic Airbnb my friends and I had rented for the weekend, a chance to unplug and unwind, but the minute we arrived, something felt off. The drive had been uneventful, with winding roads cutting through dense forest, but as we turned onto the gravel driveway, the cabin came into view. A squat, weathered structure with peeling paint and windows that seemed too small, almost like they didn't want you to see inside. Rustic charm, my friend Nate joked, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder. It'll look better in the morning. It didn't. The inside was just as unsettling. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, and the furniture looked like it had been scavenged from an estate sale in the 1970s. A faded rug covered most of the living room floor, and the only decoration was a mounted deer head above the fireplace, its glassy eyes following us no matter where we moved. Quaint, my friend Sarah said, her tone laced with sarcasm. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, all small and bare except for creaky beds and mismatched nightstands. The bathroom was down a narrow hallway, its mirror cracked and the faucet dripping sporadically. By nightfall, the unease had settled over us like a heavy blanket. The air inside felt thick, and the woods outside were too quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. After dinner, we lit a fire and sat in the living room, trying to shake the cabin's weird vibe. Nate pulled out a deck of cards, and we started a game of poker. The mood lightened for a while, laughter and teasing filling the room. But then Sarah froze, her eyes fixed on the window behind me. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" Nate asked, turning to look. "I thought I saw someone out there," she said, pointing to the woods. I turned to look, but all I saw was darkness, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. "It's probably just your imagination," I said, trying to sound confident. But Sarah didn't look convinced. We decided to call it a night. As we headed to our rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before climbing into bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a soft creaking sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate groan of wood under weight, like footsteps on the floorboards. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound moved closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Then came the whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. I wanted to scream, but fear held me frozen. The doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, my eyes locked on the door. The rattling stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open, just a crack. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, ready to defend myself, but the hallway was empty. I waited, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but nothing happened. Finally, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and peek into the hallway. It was empty, the other doors still closed. I stepped out, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and crept toward the living room. That's when I saw it. A figure stood by the fireplace, its back to me. It was tall and impossibly thin, its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't turn, but I could feel it watching me. I stumbled backward, bumping into the wall with a thud. The figure's head snapped around, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale and stretched tight, its eyes black pits that seemed to suck in the light. Its mouth stretched into a grin, revealing teeth too sharp, too jagged. It took a step toward me, and I ran. I banged on Nate's door, screaming his name. He opened it, groggy and confused, but one look at my face snapped him awake. "What's wrong?" he asked. "There's something in the house," I whispered, pulling him into the hallway. We woke Sarah, who was equally terrified when we told her what I'd seen. Nate grabbed a fireplace poker, and we cautiously made our way back to the living room. It was empty. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The mounted deer head seemed to glare at us, its glass eyes almost alive. "You sure you saw something?" Nate asked, though his voice wavered. "I know what I saw," I said, my eyes darting around the room. Then Sarah pointed to the floor. There, in the dust-covered rug, were footprints. Long, thin, and inhuman. We decided to leave. Grabbing our bags, we piled into the car and sped down the gravel driveway, but as we reached the main road, the car sputtered and died. "No, no, no!" Nate yelled, turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. The woods around us were silent, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Then we saw the figure. It stood in the middle of the road, its head tilted, its grin impossibly wide. Nate tried the ignition again, and the car roared to life. He floored it, but when we reached the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur, and we didn't stop until we were miles away, safe in a gas station parking lot. We didn't speak of it again, but I know we all felt the same thing, that whatever we saw in that cabin wasn't done with us. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the creaking of floorboards and the faint whispering as if it followed me home.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a simple inheritance, my great-uncle's house, a weathered Victorian tucked into the woods of upstate New York. I hadn't known him well, but he'd left the house to me in his will, along with a cryptic warning: leave the cellar door locked. When I first arrived, the house looked every bit as eerie as you'd expect. The paint was peeling, the windows were streaked with grime, and the porch creaked underfoot like a groan of protest. Still, it was mine, and I planned to sell it after a bit of cleaning. A house like this had history, but I didn't need history. I needed money. The first few days passed without incident. I scrubbed layers of dust off the furniture, fixed a leaky faucet, and managed to get the ancient boiler working. It was exhausting, but satisfying in a way. Then I found the cellar door. It was in the kitchen, hidden behind a tall pantry. The lock was a heavy iron padlock, rusted with age. A chill ran through me as I remembered my great-uncle's words: leave the cellar door locked. But curiosity is a powerful thing. I reasoned that I should at least know what was down there. Maybe tools or old family heirlooms. After all, it was my house now. It took some effort, but I broke the lock with a hammer. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and cold, carrying a faint, sour odor that made my stomach churn. I hesitated, but then I grabbed a flashlight and started down. The cellar was massive, the stone walls slick with moisture. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, illuminating shelves lined with jars of cloudy liquid and dusty crates piled in the corners. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface stained and scarred. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, their metal rusted but still sturdy. My unease deepened, but I told myself it was just an old house with a creepy basement. Nothing unusual. Then I saw the symbols. They were carved into the walls, intricate and looping, like some kind of runes or ancient script. My flashlight caught the glint of something embedded in the stone, dark stains that could only be dried blood. I backed away, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint sound like a whisper carried on the damp air. "Help me." I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was coming from deeper in the cellar. Against every instinct, I followed the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, leading me to a small door at the back of the cellar. It was half-rotted, its wood splintered and warped. I pushed it open, revealing a narrow passageway that led to another room. This one was different, smaller, almost claustrophobic, with walls covered in the same carved symbols. In the center of the room stood a mirror. It was massive, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass was dark, almost black, but as I approached, I saw my reflection, or at least, I thought it was my reflection. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its movements were wrong, delayed, jerky, like a poorly synced video. Its eyes were darker, its face gaunt, and its mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach its eyes. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. "Stay with me." The figure in the mirror stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and for a moment I thought it was going to come through. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the cellar door shut behind me. I fumbled with the broken lock, trying to wedge it back into place. Then the house went silent. Too silent. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the boiler. But there was nothing. And then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, moving up the cellar stairs. I backed away, my hands shaking. The doorknob rattled, and I grabbed a chair, jamming it under the handle. The footsteps stopped. For hours, I sat there clutching the hammer, my eyes fixed on the door. Nothing happened. Finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, and everything seemed normal. But the cellar door was open. I packed my things and left that day. The house could rot for all I cared. I wasn't staying another night. I sold it to a developer without ever explaining what I'd found. They planned to tear it down and build condos. But sometimes late at night, I think about that mirror. And I swear in my dreams, I still hear the whispers.